Let's unpack all of this now with Saul Eslake, who is an economist. He joins me live from Hobart in Tasmania. Saul, what are your thoughts about the WTO? Do you think that, given today's climate, it can still be relevant?
I think it can still be relevant, and I certainly hope it will be. But the WTO has really been struggling since the effective collapse of the Doha round of trade negotiations at the WTO meeting in Seattle in 1999. And despite several attempts, it's never been able to get that round back on course. So the last major comprehensive reforms over which the WTO presided was really the Uruguay round of trade negotiations that was set in train by its predecessor, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. The WTO has become a very unwieldy organization with 164 members, as your introduction said. And although in theory decisions could be made by majority vote, the practice has been that, as they say, nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. And with increasing tensions both between the so-called Western countries of Europe, North America, Japan, and parts of the Asia Pacific, and China on the other, and now Russia, but also long-standing differences about how the rules of the trading system ought to operate between developed and developing countries, between the so-called North and South. It's been very difficult for the WTO to achieve other than small piecemeal reforms. And what now seems to be happening is that its rules are becoming increasingly irrelevant and outdated, given the way in which trade is changing over the last decade. That's been exacerbated by the supply chain difficulties that have arisen in the aftermath of COVID, and by the tensions that are emerging between some of the WTO's members that spill over into this arena as they do into so many others.
You know, I remember that WTO meeting in Seattle, well, the one that you mentioned, and all the protests. It seems like there's been a long time now that people have been upset with the organization. As far as the calls for reforming the institution, what would it take for that to happen, and what needs to be done?
I think it would take a real commitment by the world's biggest economic powers, that is to say, the United States, the European Union, China, and other developing countries, to make the system work, to make compromises, and to seek to find common ground. Part of the problem has been that although the WTO ostensibly represents part of the rules-based international order that Western countries say they're striving to uphold in the face of threats from autocratic regimes like China and Russia, the US itself has done a great deal, particularly during Donald Trump's presidency, to undermine the capacity of the WTO to act as a fair and independent arbiter of trade disputes. The US blocked the appointment of members of the WTO's dispute resolution bodies for more than 4 years, and the Biden administration hasn't really corrected those impediments that were created by the Trump administration. And more broadly, there doesn't seem to be the degree of goodwill between countries with different views as to how the world trading system ought to operate or ought to be reformed to make any real progress.
What are the longer term implications here if the WTO isn't able to make a complete restoration of its functions? Are we looking at a risk of further instability and uncertainty globally?
I think we're at risk of seeing further fragmentation of the world trading system, something that has been creeping over the last 20 years as countries frustrated by the inability to write new rules at the global level that apply to everyone, instead look to undertake bilateral or regional agreements among themselves, which create a much more complicated playing field for companies. That's overlaid by the increased emphasis that many countries are now placing on the security of their supply chains in the face of increasing geopolitical tensions, so that trade is now not necessarily taking place between countries who have the greatest comparative advantage in the production of different goods and services, but is increasingly being managed along political lines, which is bound to have detrimental effects for not just businesses, but consumers, particularly in countries that have long lacked access to the global trading system in the way that the world's largest and richest economies have almost always had.
All right, we're going to leave it there for now. Saul Eslake joining me from Hobart in Tasmania. Thank you, Saul.
Thank you, Rachel. Thanks for having me on the program.